when it comes to American superhero comics and American mythology, you know, that thing that we all know and love and treasure right here at Thinking Critical YouTube, it all kind of starts with Superman. In many ways, Superman is the story of Curt Swan. And in a lot of ways, Curt Swan is the story of Superman. They're so intertwined, you know, that vision of Superman you have with his hands on his hips, chest popped out, you know, with his haircut and everything. You know, that's Curt Swan's vision of Superman. And I like to go back and read up on some of these awesome creators from the past and, you know, just see what I can glean from their life and the way that they conducted themselves and the way that the industry treated them and stuff like that. A little while back, I talked about Herb Trimpe, you know, and resiliency is what you can really learn from Herb Trimpe, where the comic book industry turned his back on him. And he didn't say, woe is me. I'm sure he was mad about it, but he said, screw this, I'm going to do something else. I'm going to find a new way. You know, went out there and got his degree, became an art teacher and stuff and like that in school, which I thought was really cool stuff. Because when you find yourself hard on your luck, you got to get yourself back up. You got to find a new plan, a new way to do it. And certainly Curt Swan had resiliency, but he also has just this amazing career. And you can see why he would have been really drawn to a character like Superman. Curt Swan was a very humble guy. You know, he went out there, didn't showboat, didn't think too highly of himself, was out there freely talking to people, giving stuff away. We'll talk about this in the article that I have, which is basically based off of the autobiography, Curt Swan, A Life in Comics from Eddie Zeno. And I certainly suggest anybody go out there, read up on this and the amazing life of Curt Swan, the impact that he had on comic books, and likely had on you that you probably don't even know to this day. But hopefully we can kind of fill in some of these blanks and talk about Curt Swan and why he's such an inspirational person, somebody that we can all kind of look up to and really admire for what he did for Superman. I mean, he literally, I think the first time he draws Superman is 1948. And then the last time that it's published that he drew Superman is 1996, the year of his death. Now, he didn't obviously draw it after. It was published after that. So he had done it before, but you're talking almost like 50 years of work documented on Superman. And he was the definitive Superman artist of his time and really of all time, really starting in the 60s all the way up to like 1985, 1986, when you have John Byrne come in with Man of Steel. They took him off as Superman, and I imagine he was very upset about that. Certainly changed his life. But if you read up on the guy, shockingly, I know you're going to be shocked by this, Curt Swan was a man that was in the military. He was shipped off to Europe, and he ended up going down to like Northern Africa and Italy during World War II. Now, I don't think he was a rifleman or anything like that. I think he was actually an illustrator for the Stars and Stripes, but he would have been a witness to real heroism, to real acts of bravery by the men in his unit. And seeing that kind of thing, can't help but admire those types of acts and really appreciate what it takes to be a real hero. And I think that's one of the reasons a guy like a Curt Swan or a Herb Trimpe or a Stan Lee or a Jack Kirby, all men that went to war and saw acts of heroism, if they didn't commit them themselves, would have been so damn good at this stuff. And why we probably don't get as much of that awesome superheroic stuff, the heroic nature of the character. A lot of times we get the dark nature of the character. What's the worst thing that this character could do? What would this character be on their worst day? Rather than appreciating how amazing they were, rather than appreciating the hero for what they stand for in their bravest hour, which is certainly something that Curt Swan and all the Superman writers that he worked with, you know, for over 4 decades, really would have been exemplifying in Superman. That would have made him the greatest superhero in the history of comic books. Now, enough with that. Let's talk about the article and some of the stuff that you can kind of glean about Curt Swan and his life. Autobiographer Eddie Zeno talked to Swan's ex-wife, his son, and 2 daughters, and learned how he would always give his family time and attention while working from home, and how his flexible approach, averaging 3 days on and 4 days off, playing golf if the weather was fine, or helping his children with their homework, sometimes forced him to work for long stretches into small hours to meet his deadlines. Popping on his cigarettes, the kids always knew they had to be very quiet in the house the morning after that, talking about when he had one of those long sessions where he had to get all that work in, which is pretty crazy. If you think about Curt Swan working 4 days on, 3 days off, he normally illustrated 2 comic books a month. So he was doing 40 pages essentially in like 16 to 18 days in a month. Absolutely prolific schedule. No modern artist can probably even keep up with that. John Romita Jr. probably could back in the day, but I don't think he can even do that anymore. Nobody works that fast. And the reason that he did it, and the reason that he had to crunch it all in there, because he wanted to spend time with his family. It's so important to spend time with your children and let them know that, yeah, daddy's work or mommy's work might be really important. And I definitely have to focus on that. But I've always got time for you. And I think it's really awesome that he used the fact that he was an independent artist working for DC Comics and was able to dictate his own schedule and open it up and make sure that he was always giving his family time, because he's a humble man and he knew, that his kids were very important to him. So I thought that was really cool. Wish he didn't smoke, but hey, we all have our foibles. And I think, back in the day, smoking was certainly a lot more accepted at the time. But I thought it was really cool kind of getting an insight into Curt Swan's working life and how he's always making time for his family, which is just so important. And really one of the benefits and blessings that I have, doing YouTube while being retired, to where I do get lots of time with my kids. And it's so important for them, for their spiritual well-being and their own sense of worth and all that kind of stuff, that I'm always there and able to be a part of that. And I'm not surprised Curt Swan made sure that he had that as well. Another thing that I thought was interesting from the article, when it came to his original artwork, like many comic book journeymen of his time, Swan was pretty cavalier about keeping any for himself. Much of it used to be given away to readers as letter column prizes, and gave a lot of it away himself for charitable causes. Swan might come into the city and pencil 2 or 3 covers in a day at the offices for Weisinger, who paid readers like Carrie Bates, future DC writer, for their arresting cover images, springboards for stories, not with money, but with original cover artwork. But one story meant a lot to him. One of the few he both penciled and inked. He made a point of giving everyone in the family a page from the story I Flew with Superman, he made a point of giving everyone in the family a page from the story I Flew with Superman, from Superman Annual number 9 in 1983, in which Swan himself appears and helps the Man of Steel solve a case. And I think that's pretty cool that, there was a time you could write something into a letters page, and if it was a cool letter and it was appreciated, you would get a freaking piece of original art from Curt Swan as a thank you. Like, what kind of times were those? It's just a different time, a different place, where I'm sure that Curt Swan knew what he was doing was valuable. He was getting paid for it. He's the definitive Superman artist by that time. But to go out there and give that kind of stuff away, it would have been so cool to be like a Superman reader and send that letter in and be so happy that it got published. And then you get a piece of original art back. It's just so really cool. And then, the story about Carrie Bates. Carrie Bates, when he was 13, was getting paid in DC comic cover original art for his ideas for covers and stories and stuff that they would end up using in the comic books. And then by the time he was 17, DC were paying him real money, to create stories with them. And obviously he ended up working with Curt Swan for a really long time. And I think that stuff's just cool. It's just such a different era, in America, where everyone was kind of resilient. When you go back to like a Jim Shooter, 14 years old, families having rough times financially. I got to figure out a way to make money. I can't work in a steel factory. I need to find out how to write comic books correctly and sell I need to figure out how to write comic books really well and sell those stories to DC Comics and help my family. And you got Carrie Bates probably looking for a little extra scratch, doing what he could, to help out the family and stuff. And it wasn't abnormal when you're that age to really go out there and make a real contribution, not just to your family, but really to society and stuff like that. A lot of times I do feel like I'm born in the wrong era. I had a job when I was 14. I had a job pretty much all the way through high school. And by the time I was graduating high school, I'd already signed up for the military, and I worked all the way until the day essentially I retired. Work was never something abnormal. It was just kind of expected. And I feel out of place a lot of times, where I think I would feel much more in place with Curt Swan back in the day and a Carrie Bates. And the fact that he didn't keep all of his art and he did give it away and used it for charitable auctions to try and help people really does speak to the character of the man and how he saw himself. That really does resonate with Superman. Humble, appreciative, wanting to help people out. And that's really who he was. And I think that's why he is synonymous with Superman to this day. And that's why Superman is synonymous with Curt Swan to this day, because I do think he shared a lot of the same characteristics. And like I said, you could see why he would have resonated with this character and illustrated him for such a long time. And then when you hear stuff like this, you kind of get a little bit depressed about it all, because he was probably never even appreciated, at least by DC Comics, certainly by the fans. There were other times when Swan could get frustrated with DC, and later he was offered deals to switch to Marvel, but he stayed loyal to the end as the benefits were good and the work was steady, or at least it was until his style went out of fashion. Swan was never fired, but he was taken off the monthly Superman books in 1986's relaunch for a long time. Superman books for 1986's relaunch, and for a long time, toward the end, his assignments were drying up. Writer Roger Stern recalls a dinner in 1988, one of the first group super summits with Mike Carlin, Jerry Ordway, George Perez, Kerry Gamil, and Swan, who was there too, enjoying being asked for the first time to give his input. Stern comments, to have this guy who so understood how the character moved and lived and had ideas about it, and they never used it. They never tapped into that resource. It just breaks your heart. And I know, and I completely understand that Curt Swan is not the creator, co-creator of Superman, Siegel and Schuster. But those guys didn't put near as much time in on Superman as Curt Swan did. There's likely nobody in the history of the world that understood what Superman was, what he represented, what motivated him, the way Superman would react to things better than Curt Swan, because probably nobody had a more personal relationship with Superman than Curt Swan. And then when you find out that they never really tapped into it, I know he had some inputs in there at some points. I believe he and Jim Shooter came up with the Superman versus the Flash race, which is still iconic to this day. You see that play out where there's a Superman show, a Flash show, a cartoon. They want to put on the movies. You see it in the comic books every 5 or 6 years. Those two go off for a race. It was a Curt Swan and Jim Shooter idea, which is not surprising. But for this man to give his heart and soul to DC Comics, and especially Superman, for at that point, you were talking 40 years, 30 years at least, just specifically to Superman. And for them to never really tap into it and say, hey, what would be the perfect Superman story, or how should Superman react? They kind of just said, you know what, here's the script illustrated, which is fine. He is an artist, but he was so much more than that to the character. And you could imagine, after being synonymous with Superman, not just in comic books, but in comic strips for all that time, and really revolutionizing the way the character looked and being there, and you can kind of look at it. He illustrated stories from the original creator, Jerry Siegel, and he was illustrated stuff by Dan Jurgens, who's still writing comic books to this day. It's like this. And if you think about it, Curt Swan is this enormous piece of connective tissue to the history and lineage and legacy of Superman. He was there. He connects the very beginning to modern day Superman and creators that are still working, that are still telling Superman stories. Dan Jurgens was on Action Comics until about 4 or 5 years ago. And he's just this awesome a figure in there. And to know that Marvel gave him the opportunity, and certainly he would have seen DC Comics be the hottest publisher out there, overtaken by Marvel Comics, and then Superman no longer being the number one character, overtaken by Amazing Spider-Man. And I imagine when Marvel tried to get him, they probably offered him the Spider-Man gig. And it would have been real easy, you know what? Let's move to the new hotness of the day. But he stayed true to the character and the publisher because he wanted to illustrate Superman. And I think that's admirable to have that kind of loyalty. Nobody really has that. You think about Chris Claremont and X-Men, and you're like, wow, 13 years. Curt Swan did twice that, and he was the illustrator. Artists stay on characters like that, really in the history of comic books, but certainly not nowadays. And for a man to have that kind of loyalty to the character and the fans is just really admirable to me. And, I'm glad that he was able to go to that Super Summit, and they were actually able to talk to him about how he thought about Superman and what the character means and stuff like that, because it probably should have happened 20 years earlier. And it's unfortunate that it didn't happen 20 years earlier. Here's another interesting story that I kind of liked. Elliot S. Maggin, barely 20 in 1971, when he started scripting Superman for Swan, 30 years his senior. As he puts it, divide and conquer was a widely respected management technique, and Maggin avoided Swan after he was told that Swan wanted to throttle him for the elaborate digressions in his scripts. But in the mid-'80s, toward the end of their time working apart, they got to hang out over a little libation, and they found out that we were both philosophical products of the message we spent a career delivering to the hero worshippers of the world. We both believed in truth, justice, and the American way, a personal Torah. It was good finally to learn that we had so much in common when finally we gave each other the space to reveal it. It's so cool that they were able to finally kind of get back together, 15, 16 years after that, and realized they had both came to Superman for the same reason, because they believed in Superman and what he represented. It just so happens they had, different, techniques or ideas on how to execute it. And obviously, if you're the artist that's been working on Superman for over a decade at this point, You've got Johnny Come Lately in his early 20s that's changing scripting styles. I could see why he would get a little bit cheesed about that. But when you listen to that, we both believed in truth, justice, in the American way. They believed in what Superman represented. And you can see why Curt Swan would have been able to deliver the greatest Superman images and illustrate some of the greatest Superman stories of all time, because he bought into the character. He understood who Superman was. When's the last time somebody was truly on Superman? You're like, you know what? I don't think he's writing this for the paycheck. I think he's writing it because he loves Superman. It doesn't happen all that time. When you read that Marv Wolfman 100-page giant, that was released like 5 years ago, that man loves Superman. When you see Peter J. Tomasi exploring Superman as being a parent, yes, he loves Superman. Certainly Dan Jurgens loves Superman. But we seem to get far more people like a Brian Michael Bendis that don't come to Superman because they love him. They come to Superman because they want to change him, because they don't, in their heart, believe in truth, justice, in the American way. And they've been trying to remove the American way for so long now, and now it's truth, justice, and a better tomorrow or something generically stupid like that, which isn't Superman. And you can see why a Curt Swan or an Herb Trimpe or a Stan Lee and your Jack Kirby and your Gardner Foxes would have been so much better at this stuff, because they believed in heroism. They didn't believe America was a terrible place. They didn't think that Superman was the ultimate sign of the great white savior, or whatever it is nonsense that John really likes to say. They knew what Superman represented. Somebody that could be the leader of the world. He could take everything and rule over everyone. Superman chooses not to do that because he believes in America and what it represents. And he wants to be an enabler of freedom. He doesn't want to, squash down your ability to think or say whatever you want. He just wants you to be safe, and he wants you to be free out there and not held down by governments and villains and all that kind of stuff. Superman represents so many amazing things out there, and it feels like a lot of writers are embarrassed by it, or they downright hate it. You can't write the world's greatest Superman story if you don't love Superman. And that goes for a lot of these characters. You can't write an amazing Spider-Man story if you don't get Spider-Man. Look what Zeb Wells is doing right now. You can't write awesome Batman stories if you don't understand who Batman is and what he represents. Go see what Tom King did. There are so many people, so many creators out there that can learn from a Curt Swan. You have to believe in what the characters represent. You have to think that it's good in order to make it as amazing as possible. If you think that the character represents something bad, or the character is misguided, or their motivations are completely wrong, you are going to turn them into a villain because you hate the character. You have to come to these characters with true love to really be able to let them sing and be who they're supposed to be, and remembered, and be part of that legend, that mythos, that lore that's been created, within American comic books for over 80 years now. The last thing I'll talk about is actually from Alan Moore. You don't see him getting too sentimental, but you can clearly see he has a great affinity for Curt Swan himself. Alan Moore muses about Swan. I'd like to have asked him how much he identified with Superman, how much of himself he put in there. I feel that he probably did on some private level, that there was some sort of moral strength that he aspired to, that he drew into those figures, something almost indefinable, but some essence of himself. And that's a really cool way to think about it, because you and I can never know Curt Swan. He died when I was graduating high school, and I'm not a young man. I'm damn near 50 years old now. He's been gone a long time, but we can learn about Curt Swan, and we can have a bit of a relationship with him if you go and look at his Superman and you read the stories and you see the way that he illustrated him, and you saw him and you see the way that he illustrates him, and the way that the character acts and reacts and all those things, because that's how Curt Swan felt about not only Superman, but there were also pieces of himself in there. And I'm not talking about what they do nowadays with the self-insert characters, where you have Steve Orlando, putting Somnus the Sleep Raper in there because he needs an exact replica of himself, in the X-Men universe, or Charlie Jean Anders putting Escapade in there because there needs to be an exact replication of herself in the comic book, or Alyssa Wong with Una Yang in Captain Marvel because Captain Marvel's not interesting. Una Yang, Alyssa Wong is. You got to put Alyssa Wong in the story. Curt Swan put himself into Superman, but it never overtook the character. He inspired to be as good as Superman, to show out the bravery and heroics that he likely witnessed on the battlefield himself. And there is a piece of him there, just like there's a piece of Alan Moore in The Watchmen, and there's a piece of Frank Miller in Daredevil. If you go back there and you read those stories and allow yourself to really get into it and what they're saying and what they're trying to represent with the story itself and the illustrations itself, and it just it's a really fun experience. Right now I'm going back and I'm reading DC: The New Frontier. We're basically reviewing every episode on the Patreon, part of the Comics Guild thing that I do. And it's just an amazing story. And you could see Darwin Cook was over the moon in love with the Silver Age of DC Comics, and it comes out in every single page. When's the last time a modern writer made you feel that about what they are writing, that they truly were in love with the character, what they represented, and wanted to do the best job possible? That they didn't want to put their own personal stamp on the character, that they didn't want to change the character, that they wanted to embrace the character and really let them shine as who they are. Darwin Cook could do that. Curt Swan can do that. Obviously, Jack Kirby can do that. A lot of these great creators can do that. There are a few creators out there, I think, that are still able to do that. I really do appreciate Jeremy Adams and Robert Venditti, and you certainly have Jeff Johns out there. But the numbers are fewer and fewer. It almost feels like every single month, of writers who actually care, artists that actually care about the character and making sure that they're telling the best story possible with them. And I think they could all learn a lesson or two from Curt Swan. And I think you and I can learn a few lessons from Curt Swan on superheroics, on Superman, on how to live life, make time for your kids, be humble, give stuff away if you have it to give away. Not everything has to be going out there and helping your community, doing charitable stuff is great if you have the means to do it and you have the ability. And sometimes you won't be respected or given the voice that you deserve with the work that you put in there, but you remain humble, you keep working in there, and eventually everyone's going to recognize you for who you are and what you've accomplished. And I do hope everyone recognizes who Curt Swan is, the definitive Superman artist, not of his time, but of all time. And I think that's a really great stuff. And I really do like Gary Frank. I think Gary Frank has an amazing feel for Superman, and I think he has great Superman illustrations. When I think about Superman, I kind of think about Gary Frank, but he's not the definitive artist. It's Curt Swan, and certainly Gary Frank was inspired by Curt Swan, and we should all be. And if you're a Superman fan like I am, we should be thanking Curt Swan for what he was able to do, and really getting to know these things. And I do really appreciate you taking the time to listen to this and conversations about some of the older creators out there. I did mention earlier, I did a video on Herb Trimpe, the artist from Marvel Comics for several decades, and his resiliency and what you got. Earlier in the video, I talked about Herb Trimpe, former Marvel artist, and the lessons that we could learn on resiliency from him and his career and the way that he took things. I do want to invite you, if you haven't already, to check out this video where I talk about Herb Trimpe, what he did in his real journey there at the end. Really enjoy this video.